Welcome to the continuing series of working with Scribus. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss working with fill, colors, gradients, and patterns. So let's start with a brand new document. I'm going to insert a text frame as I would normally do, and let's edit that text frame. Go to properties, and for the frame itself, let's make the text multi-column by going to text, column, and distance. Text distances. We'll change the column to 2, and then let's look at the gap. Remember again, I want to change the tenths column, so I hold down the shift key and click here and I roll. So let's make the gap a third of an inch. Alright, so now we've got a text frame that's split into two columns. Now let's go to colors. When we open up colors on the property, you'll see that it defaults to normal, and there's going to be two choices here. We can edit the line color, or we can edit the fill color. So let's start with the line color so that you can see the contrast better. Right now, if I unclick out of here, you see my line color is basically non-existent. In other words, I'm not going to see any frame when if I were to go to print this document. So if I go to, colors, line, and let's change the line color to black. Let's just use simple black. All right. Now, when you go over to the text frame, you see that the frame is now got a black line all the way around it. And if I wanted to, I could change that to whatever color we have available here in our color menu. Alright, what's more interesting is working with the fill colors. So I click on the fill box, and that's generally um, what the properties is going to open up to. So let's just pick a color um, so you can see the contrast or see what happens here. I just clicked on the color, and then it automatically fills the entire text frame. Now if I wanted to, I can change the shade. Changing the shade is basically changing the saturation of the color. So at 100% it's fully saturated, and then as I click down it gets the saturation changes. Alright, the other thing that we have here is the opacity. Now this is how much you can see through the actual color. So if I start clicking on this, you'll see now that the grid is shining through the the color, and this would be useful, of course, if we had multiple layers of documents, which we'll talk about in a separate lecture. So let's go back up to 100%. Now the other thing I want to show you is let's insert into here some sample text, and let's use the standard um, lorem ipsum, the fake Latin, and you see that the text is showing in black, and the background is fully it's not opaque at all. There's no see-through or bleed whatsoever. All right, so now how do we change the color of the text? You notice that's not here. This is only for the line and the fill. If we want to change the color of the text, we have to go back to text and then color and effects. And you see here I can change the color of the print from black to the same color menu that we had before. So let's pick something bizarre like magenta, and then you can see now we've got a blue background or blue fill with the uh, magenta text. Now if I want to change the saturation of the text, I also do it here with this bar here or button. So it's at 100%. If I change it to 50%, you can see what happens to the color magenta. Not very useful at that, but you can see anyway what would happen with changing the saturation here. So color for text and saturation for text are both done in the text menu. Now, what about opacity? Well, we go back to the colors and you'll see here this opacity is, if I decrease it, you notice that it affects both the text and the fill at the same time. And that's how we would increase or decrease the opacity of both text and the fill. All right, now let's look at working with gradients. As we said before, we have this normal box here, normal menu, but if you click on it, you can see other choices such as horizontal gradient. Now notice when I clicked on horizontal gradient, the color changed because the shade went back up to 100% saturation. So how does the horizontal gradient work? We have these red buttons here which indicate stop points, so we can change or move color here. So, and then double clicking or just clicking somewhere else will bring us another stop point which we can put in, and perhaps we'll just bring the end one over a little bit. All right, so now we've set a gradient. Well, you say, well, I can't really see any difference. Well, when you change the saturation, you're going to notice a difference immediately. So watch what happens as I decrease the saturation, and you see now we have colors that have gradient. All right, so we can move that. We could add another stop point and adjust accordingly. And you see things start moving here with different levels of colors. So it looks like we have a transition from one color to another. All right, now what happens if you change this to vertical? Well, as you expect, it flips. So now we have a vertical gradient. If I do diagonal, you see that we have a diagonal gradient down here, and as you can imagine, the cross diagonal is going to do the opposite. And then we also have a radial gradient, which, as you can see here, creates a circle. All right, now what else is left? We have free linear gradient. Now when I click on that, you notice that the we get this button here called move vector. Now what I can do is take this gradient and I can change the XY coordinates so that you see what starts to happen here. If I click on these, they start rotating. If I click on the other side, you notice it starts rotating. Here, same thing. So you can play with these as you wish. You can also drag the control point here. This is the end point, so you can only drag the control point, shrink it, expand it, and that's working with free linear. And as you'd imagine, free radial is the same thing with the circle, so you can move this or you can use the spin wheel, whatever your preference is. So that's working with gradients. One last topic to talk about is the use of patterns. In order to use patterns, you have to have some patterns already imported into Scribus. If we go to Edit Patterns, we see there are no patterns here. So we could load files from the internet if we found patterns or tiles that we were interested in. And you can use any bitmap or vector graphic, or we can actually create them in Scribus. So this example here of a color that we were experimenting with here, where I have a cross diagonal gradient, I can turn that into a pattern. How do I do that? Well, if I right click on the text box, I can say click on send to patterns and give it a name. So blue, actually the color was cyan, wasn't it? Cyan, um, cross, diagonal, and click on OK. All right, now when I go to colors, you'll see that I have the ability to use a pattern. So for example, we go here and then under the menu, we now see a new box called pattern, and I can click on that and all of my patterns will be displayed here. If I want, I could create, let's do this. Let's get rid of this particular text box. Let's insert a shape. Let's pick something interesting. So let's just pick a big triangle and then go to colors. And instead of playing with gradients, I can just go to pattern and click on it. And then you see my object now automatically has this as a pattern. And we can play with this. You could put anything you wanted into here. For example, I could put an actual drawing in here that was part of a pattern. So to do that, I would go to edit, go to patterns, and then I would load a file. Now let's go to the place where the file you want to load is located on your PC, and I'm going to use our Leaning in Tower of Pisa from the exercise we did earlier in the course. I'm going to click on OK, and now I have a pattern called Johnny Automatic Leaning Tower of Pisa. Click on OK. Now let's create another insert frame. So let's just do something like this, and then I can go to colors, I can select pattern, and I can select that pattern, and it automatically gets imported as background, not as the actual image here. So you could do that with any kind of bitmap or vector graphic. As a matter of fact, if you go back to edit patterns and load file, you can see all the kinds of files that are supported for loading patterns. And that's basically it for color and fill.